replied. He paused and repeated, "Stop the mails." He felt the paralysis this involved and was silent, and changed the subject. In answer to questions as to what I should do, I always pointed out that America had many legislatures, but only one Congress. Britain should follow her example. One Parliament and local legislatures, not parliaments, for Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. These should be made states like New York and Virginia. But as Britain has no Supreme Court, as we have, to decide upon laws passed not only by state legislatures but by Congress, the judicial being the final authority, and not the political, Britain should have Parliament as the one national final authority over Irish measures. Therefore, the acts of the local legislature of Ireland should lie for 3 months' continuous session upon the table of the House of Commons, subject to adverse action of the House, but becoming operative unless disapproved. The provision would be a dead letter unless improper legislation were enacted. But if there were improper legislation, then it would be salutary. The clause, I said, was needed to assure timid people that no secession could arise. Urging this view upon Mr. Morley afterwards, he told me this had been proposed to Parnell but rejected. Mr. Gladstone might then have said, "Very well, this provision is not needed for myself and others who think with me, but it is needed to enable us to carry Britain with us. I am now unable to take up the question. The responsibility is yours." One morning at Hawarden, Mrs. Gladstone said, "William tells me he has such extraordinary conversations with you." These he had, no doubt. He had not often, if ever, heard the breezy talk of a genuine Republican, and did not understand my inability to conceive of different hereditary ranks. It seemed strange to me that men should deliberately abandon the name given them by their parents, and that name the parents' name. Especially amusing were the new titles which required the old hereditary nobles much effort to refrain from smiling at as they greeted the newly made peer who had perhaps bought his title for £10,000, more or less, given to the party fund. Mr. Blaine was with us in London, and I told Mr. Gladstone he had expressed to me his wonder and pain at seeing him in his old age, hat in hand, cold day as it was, at a garden party doing homage to titled nobodies. Union of church and state was touched upon, and also my look ahead, which foretells the reunion of our race owing to the inability of the British Islands to expand. I had held that the disestablishment of the English Church was inevitable, because, among other reasons, it was an anomaly. No other part of the race had it. All religions were fostered, none favored, in every other English-speaking state. Mr. Gladstone asked, "How long do you give our established church to live?" My reply was I could not fix a date. He had had more experience than I in disestablishing churches. He nodded and smiled. When I had enlarged upon a certain relative decrease of populations in Britain that must come as compared with other countries of larger area, he asked, "What future do you forecast for her?" I referred to Greece among ancient nations, and said that it was, perhaps, not accident that Chaucer, Shakespeare, Spenser, Milton, Burns, Scott, Stevenson, Bacon, Cromwell, Wallace, Bruce, Hume, Watt, Spencer, Darwin, and other celebrities had arisen here. Genius did not depend upon material resources. Long after Britain could not figure prominently as an industrial nation, not by her decline, but through the greater growth of others, she might, in my opinion, become the modern Greece and achieve among nations moral ascendancy. He caught at the words, repeating them musingly. Moral ascendancy, moral ascendancy. I like that. I like that. I had never before so thoroughly enjoyed a conference with a man. I visited him again at Hawarden, but my last visit to him was at Lord Randall's at Cannes, the winter of 1897, when he was suffering keenly. He had still the old charm, and was especially attentive to my sister-in-law, Lucy, who saw him then for the first time and was deeply impressed. As we drove off, she murmured, "A sick eagle, a sick eagle." Nothing could better describe this wan and worn leader of men as he appeared to me that day. He was not only a great, but a truly good man, stirred by the purest impulses, a high, imperious soul always looking upward. He had, indeed, earned the title foremost citizen of the world. In Britain, in 1881, I had entered into business relations with Samuel Storey, M.P., a very able man, a stern radical, and a genuine Republican. We purchased several British newspapers and began a campaign of political progress upon radical lines. Passmore Edwards and some others joined us, but the result was not encouraging. Harmony did not prevail among my British friends, and finally I decided to withdraw, which I was fortunately able to do without loss. My third literary venture, Triumphant Democracy, had its origin in realizing how little the best informed foreigner, or even Briton, knew of America, and how distorted that little was. It was prodigious what these eminent Englishmen did not then know about the Republic. My first talk with Mr. Gladstone in 1882 can never be forgotten, when I had occasion to say that the majority of the English speaking race was now Republican, and it was a minority of monarchists who were upon the defensive. He said, "Why, how is that?" "Well, Mr. Gladstone," I said, "the Republic holds sway over a larger number of English speaking people than the population of Great Britain and all her colonies, even if the English speaking colonies were numbered twice over." "Ah, how is that? What is your population?" "66 millions, and yours is not much more than half." "Ah, yes, surprising." With regard to the wealth of the nations, it was equally surprising for him to learn that the census of 1880 proved the hundred-year-old republic could purchase Great Britain and Ireland and all their realized capital and investments and then pay off Britain's debt, and yet not exhaust her fortune. But the most startling statement of all was that which I was able to make when the question of free trade was touched upon. I pointed out that America was now the greatest manufacturing nation in the world. At a later date, I remember Lord Chancellor Haldane fell into the same error, calling Britain the greatest manufacturing country in the world, and thanked me for putting him right. I quoted Mulhall's figures. British manufactures in 1880, 816 million sterling. American manufactures, 1,126 million sterling. His one word was, "Incredible." Other startling statements followed, and he asked, "Why does not some writer take up this subject and present the facts in a simple and direct form to the world?" I was then, as a matter of fact, gathering material for Triumphant Democracy, in which I intended to perform the very service which he indicated, as I informed him. Round the World and The American Four in Hand gave me not the slightest effort, but the preparation of Triumphant Democracy, which I began in 1882, was altogether another matter. It required steady, laborious work. Figures had to be examined and arranged, but as I went forward, the study became fascinating. For some months I seemed to have my head filled with statistics. The hours passed away unheeded. It was evening when I supposed it was midday. The second serious illness of my life dates from the strain brought upon me by this work, for I had to attend to business as well. I shall think twice before I trust myself again with anything so fascinating as figures. End of chapter 24. Recording by William Tomko. Chapter 25 of Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomko. Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. Chapter 25. Herbert Spencer and his disciple. Herbert Spencer, with his friend Mr. Lott and myself, were fellow travelers on the Servia from Liverpool to New York in 1882. I bore a note of introduction to him from Mr. Morley, but I had met the philosopher in London before that. I was one of his disciples. As an older traveler, I took Mr. Lott and him in charge. We sat at the same table during the voyage. One day, the conversation fell upon the impression made upon us by great men at first meeting. Did they, or did they not, prove to be as we had imagined them? Each gave his experience. Mine was that nothing could be more different than the being imagined, and that being beheld in the flesh. Oh, said Mr. Spencer, in my case, for instance, was this so? Yes, I replied, you more than any. I had imagined my teacher, the great calm philosopher, brooding, Buddha like, over all things, unmoved. Never did I dream of seeing him excited over the question of Cheshire or Cheddar cheese. The day before, he had peevishly pushed away the former when presented by the steward, exclaiming, Cheddar, Cheddar, not Cheshire. I said Cheddar. There was a roar in which none joined more heartily than the sage himself. He refers to this incident of the voyage in his autobiography. Spencer liked stories and was a good laugher. American stories seemed to please him more than others, and of those I was able to tell him not a few, which were usually followed by explosive laughter. He was anxious to learn about our Western territories, which were then attracting attention in Europe, and a story I told him about Texas struck him as amusing. When a returning disappointed emigrant from that state was asked about the then barren country, he said, Stranger, all that I have to say about Texas is that if I owned Texas, and hell, I would sell Texas. What a change from those early days. Texas has now over 4 millions of population and is said to have the soil to produce more cotton than the whole world did in 1882. The walk up to the house, when I had the philosopher out at Pittsburgh, reminded me of another American story of the visitor who started to come up the garden walk. When he opened the gate, a big dog from the house rushed down upon him. He retreated and closed the garden gate just in time, the host calling out, He won't touch you. You know, barking dogs never bite. Yes, exclaimed the visitor tremblingly. I know that, and you know it. But does the dog know it? One day my eldest nephew was seen to open the door quietly and peep in where we were seated. His mother afterwards asked him why he had done so, and the boy of 11 replied, Mamma, I wanted to see the man who wrote in a book that there was no use studying grammar. Spencer was greatly pleased when he heard the story and often referred to it. He had faith in that nephew. Speaking to him one day about his having signed a remonstrance against a tunnel between Calais and Dover as having surprised me, he explained that for himself he was as anxious to have the tunnel as anyone, and that he did not believe in any of the objections raised against it, but signed the remonstrance because he knew his countrymen were such fools that the military and naval element in Britain could stampede the masses, frighten them, and stimulate militarism. An increased army and navy would then be demanded. He referred to a scare which had once arisen and involved the outlay of many millions in fortifications which had proved useless. One day we were sitting in our rooms in the Grand Hotel, looking out over Trafalgar Square. The Life Guards passed, and the following took place. Mr. Spencer, I never see men dressed up like Merry Andrews without being saddened and indignant that in the 19th century the most civilized race, as we consider ourselves, still finds men willing to adopt as a profession, until lately the only profession for gentlemen, the study of the surest means of killing other men. Mr. Spencer said, I feel just so myself, but I will tell you how I curb my indignation. Whenever I feel it rising, I am calmed by this story of Emerson's. He had been hooted and hustled from the platform in Faneuil Hall for daring to speak against slavery. He describes himself walking home in violent anger, until opening his garden gate and looking up through the branches of the tall elms that grew between the gate and his modest home, he saw the stars shining through. They said to him, What, so hot, my little sir? I laughed and he laughed, and I thanked him for that story. Not seldom I have to repeat to myself, What, so hot, my little sir? And it suffices. Mr. Spencer's visit to America had its climax in the banquet given for him at Delmonico's. I drove him to it, and saw the great man there in a funk. He could think of nothing but the address he was to deliver. I believe he had rarely before spoken in public. His great fear was that he should be unable to say anything that would be of advantage to the American people, who had been the first to appreciate his works. He may have attended many banquets, but never one comprised of more distinguished people than this one. It was a remarkable gathering. The tributes paid Spencer by the ablest men were unique. The climax was reached when Henry Ward Beecher, concluding his address, turned round and addressed Mr. Spencer in these words: "To my father and my mother I owe my physical being. To you, sir, I owe my intellectual being. At a critical moment you provided the safe paths through the bogs and morasses. You were my teacher." These words were spoken in slow, solemn tones. I do not remember ever having noticed more depth of feeling. Evidently they came from a grateful debtor. Mr. Spencer was touched by the words. They gave rise to considerable remark, and shortly afterwards Mr. Beecher preached a course of sermons giving his views upon evolution. The conclusion of the series was anxiously looked for, because his acknowledgment of debt to Spencer as his teacher had created alarm in church circles. In the concluding article, as in his speech, if I remember rightly, Mr. Beecher said that although he believed in evolution, Darwinism, up to a certain point, yet when man had reached his highest human level, his Creator then invested him, and man alone of all living things, with the Holy Spirit, thereby bringing him into the circle of the godlike. Thus he answered his critics. Mr. Spencer took intense interest in mechanical devices. When he visited our works with me, the new appliances impressed him, and in after years he sometimes referred to these, and said his estimate of American invention and push had been fully realized. He was naturally pleased with the deference and attention paid him in America. I seldom, if ever, visited England without going to see him, even after he had removed to Brighton, that he might live looking out upon the sea, which appealed to and soothed him. I never met a man who seemed to weigh so carefully every action, every word, even the pettiest, and so completely to find guidance through his own conscience. He was no scoffer in religious matters. In the domain of theology, however, he had little regard for decorum. It was to him a very faulty system hindering true growth, and the idea of rewards and punishments struck him as an appeal to very low natures indeed. Still, he never went to such lengths as Tennyson did upon an occasion when some of the old ideas were under discussion. Knowles told me that Tennyson lost control of himself. Knowles said he was greatly disappointed with the son's life of the poet, as giving no true picture of his father in his revolt against stern theology. Spencer was always the calm philosopher. I believe that from childhood to old age, when the race was run, he never was guilty of an immoral act, or did an injustice to any human being. He was certainly one of the most conscientious men in all his doings that ever was born. Few men have wished to know another man more strongly than I to know Herbert Spencer, for seldom has one been more deeply indebted than I to him and to Darwin. Reaction against the theology of past days comes to many who have been surrounded in youth by church people entirely satisfied that the truth and faith indispensable to future happiness were derived only through strictest Calvinistic creeds. The thoughtful youth is naturally carried along and disposed to concur in this. He cannot but think, up to a certain period of development, that what is believed by the best and the highest educated around him, those to whom he looks for example and instruction, must be true. He resists doubt as inspired by the evil one seeking his soul, and sure to get it unless faith comes to the rescue. Unfortunately, he soon finds that faith is not exactly at his beck and call. Original sin, he thinks, must be at the root of this inability to see as he wishes to see, to believe as he wishes to believe. It seems clear to him that already he is little better than one of the lost. Of the elect he surely cannot be, for these must be ministers, elders, and strictly orthodox men. The young man is soon in chronic rebellion, trying to assume godliness with the others, acquiescing outwardly in the creed and all its teachings, and yet at heart totally unable to reconcile his outward accordance with his inward doubt. if there be intellect and virtue in the man, but one result is possible. That is, Carlyle's position after his terrible struggle, when after weeks of torment he came forth, "If it be incredible, in God's name, then let it be discredited." With that, the load of doubt and fear fell from him forever. When I, along with 3 or 4 of my boon companions, was in this stage of doubt about theology, including the supernatural element, and indeed the whole scheme of salvation through vicarious atonement and all the fabric built upon it, I came fortunately upon Darwin's and Spencer's works, the Data of Ethics, First Principles, Social Statics, The Descent of Man. Reaching the pages which explain how man has absorbed such mental foods as were favorable to him, retaining what was salutary, rejecting what was deleterious, I remember that light came as in a flood, and all was clear. Not only had I got rid of theology and the supernatural, but I had found the truth of evolution. "All is well since all grows better" became my motto, my true source of comfort. Man was not created with an instinct for his own degradation, but from the lower he had risen to the higher forms. Nor is there any conceivable end to his march to perfection. His face is turned to the light. He stands in the sun and looks upward. Humanity is an organism, inherently rejecting all that is deleterious, that is, wrong, and absorbing after trial what is beneficial, that is, right. If so disposed, the architect of the universe, we must assume, might have made the world and man perfect, free from evil and from pain, as angels in heaven are thought to be. But although this was not done, man has been given the power of advancement rather than of retrogression. The Old and New Testaments remain, like other sacred writings of other lands, of value as records of the past and for such good lessons as they inculcate. Like the ancient writers of the Bible, our thoughts should rest upon this life and our duties here. To perform the duties of this world well, troubling not about another, is a prime wisdom, says Confucius, great sage and teacher. The next world and its duties we shall consider when we are placed in it. I am as a speck of dust in the sun, and not even so much, in this solemn, mysterious, unknowable universe. I shrink back. One truth I see: Franklin was right. The highest worship of God is service to man. All this, however, does not prevent everlasting hope of immortality. It would be no greater miracle to be born to a future life than to have been born to live in this present life. The one has been created, why not the other? Therefore, there is reason to hope for immortality. Let us hope. End of chapter 25. Recording by William Tomko. Chapter 26 of Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomko. Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. Chapter 26. Blaine and Harrison. While one is known by the company he keeps, it is equally true that one is known by the stories he tells. Mr. Blaine was one of the best storytellers I ever met. He was a bright, sunny nature with a witty, pointed story for every occasion. Mr. Blaine's address at Yorktown, I had accompanied him there, was greatly admired. It directed special attention to the cordial friendship which had grown up between the two branches of the English-speaking race, and ended with the hope that the prevailing peace and goodwill between the two nations would exist for many centuries to come. When he read this to me, I remember that the word "many" jarred, and I said, "Mr. Secretary, might I suggest the change of one word? I don't like 'many.' Why not 'all the centuries to come'?" "Good! That is perfect." And so it was given in the address, "For all the centuries to come." We had a beautiful night returning from Yorktown, and sitting in the stern of the ship in the moonlight, the military band playing forward, we spoke of the effect of music. Mr. Blaine said that his favorite just then was the Sweet By and By, which he had heard played last by the same band at President Garfield's funeral. and he thought upon that occasion he was more deeply moved by sweet sounds than he had ever been in his life. He requested that it should be the last piece played that night. Both he and Gladstone were fond of simple music. They could enjoy Beethoven and the classic masters, but Wagner was as yet a sealed book to them. In answer to my inquiry as to the most successful speech he ever heard in Congress, he replied it was that of the German ex-Governor Ritter of Pennsylvania. The first bill appropriating money for inland fresh waters was under consideration. The House was divided. Strict constructionists held this to be unconstitutional. Only harbors upon the salt sea were under the federal government. The contest was keen and the result doubtful, when, to the astonishment of the House, Governor Ritter slowly arose for the first time. Silence at once reigned. What was the old German ex-governor going to say? He who had never said anything at all. Only this: "Mr. Speaker, I don't know much particulars about de Constitution, but I know dis: I wouldn't gif a damned cent for a Constitution dat didn't wash in fresh water as well as in salt." The House burst into an uproar of uncontrollable laughter, and the bill passed. So came about this new departure and one of the most beneficent ways of spending government money, and of employing Army and Navy engineers. Little of the money spent by the government yields so great a return. So expands our flexible Constitution to meet the new wants of an expanding population. Let who will make the Constitution if we of today are permitted to interpret it. Mr. Blaine's best story, if one can be selected from so many that were excellent, I think was the following. In the days of slavery and the Underground Railroads, there lived on the banks of the Ohio River near Gallipolis a noted Democrat named Judge French, who said to some anti-slavery friends that he should like them to bring to his office the first runaway Negro that crossed the river, bound northward by the Underground. He couldn't understand why they wished to run away. This was done, and the following conversation took place. Judge: "So you have run away from Kentucky? Bad master, I suppose?" Slave: "Oh no, Judge, very good kind massa." Judge: "He worked you too hard?" Slave: "No, saw, never overworked myself all my life." Judge (hesitatingly): "He did not give you enough to eat?" Slave: "Not enough to eat down in Kaintuck? Oh, Lor', plenty to eat." Judge: "He did not clothe you well?" Slave: "Good enough clothes for me, Judge." Judge: "You hadn't a comfortable home?" Slave: "Oh, Lor', makes me cry to think of my pretty little cabin down dar in old Kaintuck." Judge (after a pause): "You had a good, kind master. You were not overworked. Plenty to eat, good clothes, fine home. I don't see why the devil you wish to run away." Slave: "Well, Judge, I left de situation down dar open. You can go right down and get it." The judge had seen a great light. Freedom has 1,000 charms to show, that slaves, howe'er contented, never know. That the colored people in such numbers risked all for liberty is the best possible proof that they will steadily approach and finally reach the full stature of citizenship in the Republic. I never saw Mr. Blaine so happy as while with us at Cluny. He was a boy again, and we were a rollicking party together. He had never fished with a fly. I took him out on Loch Laggan, and he began awkwardly, as all do, but he soon caught the swing. I shall never forget his first capture. "My friend, you have taught me a new pleasure in life. There are 100 fishing lochs in Maine, and I'll spend my holidays in future upon them, trout fishing." At Cluny there is no night in June, and we danced on the lawn in the bright twilight until late. Mrs. Blaine, Miss Dodge, Mr. Blaine, and other guests were trying to do the Scotch reel, and whooping like Highlanders. We were gay revelers during those 2 weeks. One night afterwards, at a dinner in our home in New York, chiefly made up of our Cluny visitors, Mr. Blaine told the company that he had discovered at Cluny what a real holiday was. It is when the merest trifles become the most serious events of life. President Harrison's nomination for the presidency in 1888 came to Mr. Blaine while on a coaching trip with us. Mr. and Mrs. Blaine, Miss Margaret Blaine, Senator and Mrs. Hale, Miss Dodge, and Walter Damrosch were on the coach with us from London to Cluny Castle. In approaching Linlithgow from Edinburgh, we found the provost and magistrates in their gorgeous robes at the hotel to receive us. I was with them when Mr. Blaine came into the room with a cablegram in his hand, which he showed to me, asking what it meant. It read, "Use cipher." It was from Senator Elkins at the Chicago Convention. Mr. Blaine had cabled the previous day, declining to accept the nomination for the presidency unless Secretary Sherman of Ohio agreed, and Senator Elkins no doubt wished to be certain that he was in correspondence with Mr. Blaine and not with some interloper. I said to Mr. Blaine that the senator had called to see me before sailing and suggested we should have cipher words for the prominent candidates. I gave him a few and kept a copy upon a slip, which I put in my pocketbook. I looked and fortunately found it. Blaine was Victor, Harrison Trump, Phelps of New Jersey Star, and so on. I wired Trump and Star. This was in the evening. We retired for the night, and next day the whole party was paraded by the city authorities in their robes up the main street to the palace grounds, which were finely decorated with flags. Speeches of welcome were made and replied to. Mr. Blaine was called upon by the people and responded in a short address. Just then a cablegram was handed to him. Harrison and Morton nominated. Phelps had declined. So passed forever Mr. Blaine's chance of holding the highest of all political offices. He elected of the majority of the English-speaking race. But he was once fairly elected to the presidency and done out of New York State, as was at last clearly proven, the perpetrators having been punished for an attempted repetition of the same fraud at a subsequent election. Mr. Blaine, as Secretary of State in Harrison's cabinet, was a decided success and the Pan American Congress his most brilliant triumph. My only political appointment came at this time and was that of a United States delegate to the Congress. It gave me a most interesting view of the South American republics and their various problems. We sat down together, representatives of all the republics but Brazil. One morning the announcement was made that a new constitution had been ratified. Brazil had become a member of the sisterhood, making 17 republics in all, now 21. There was great applause and cordial greeting of the representatives of Brazil, thus suddenly elevated. I found the South American representatives rather suspicious of their big brother's intentions. A sensitive spirit of independence was manifest, which it became our duty to recognize. In this, I think, we succeeded, but it will behoove subsequent governments to scrupulously respect the national feeling of our Southern neighbors. It is not control, but friendly cooperation upon terms of perfect equality we should seek. I sat next to Manuel Quintana, who afterwards became president of Argentina. He took a deep interest in the proceedings, and one day became rather critical upon a trifling issue, which led to an excited colloquy between him and Chairman Blaine. I believe it had its origin in a false translation from one language to another. I rose, slipped behind the chairman on the platform, whispering to him as I passed that if an adjournment was moved, I was certain the differences could be adjusted. He nodded assent. I returned to my seat and moved adjournment, and during the interval all was satisfactorily arranged. Passing the delegates, as we were about to leave the hall, an incident occurred which comes back to me as I write. A delegate threw one arm around me, and with the other hand patting me on the breast, exclaimed, "Mr. Carnegie, you have more here than here," pointing to his pocket. Our Southern brethren are so lovingly demonstrative. Warm climes and warm hearts. In 1891, President Harrison went with me from Washington to Pittsburgh, as I have already stated, to open the Carnegie Hall and Library, which I had presented to Allegheny City. We traveled over the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad by daylight and enjoyed the trip, the President being especially pleased with the scenery. Reaching Pittsburgh at dark, the flaming coke ovens and dense pillars of smoke and fire amazed him. The well-known description of Pittsburgh, seen from the hilltops, as "hell with the lid off," seemed to him most appropriate. He was the first president who ever visited Pittsburgh. President Harrison, his grandfather, had, however, passed from steamboat to canal boat here on his way to Washington after election. The opening ceremony was largely attended owing to the presence of the president, and all passed off well. Next morning, the president wished to see our steelworks, and he was escorted there, receiving a cordial welcome from the workmen. I called up each successive manager of department as we passed and presented him. Finally, when Mr. Schwab was presented, the president turned to me and said, "How is this, Mr. Carnegie? You present only boys to me." "Yes, Mr. President, but do you notice what kind of boys they are?" "Yes, hustlers, every one of them," was his comment. He was right. No such young men could have been found for such work elsewhere in this world. They had been promoted to partnership without cost or risk. If the profits did not pay for their shares, no responsibility remained upon the young men. A giving thus to partners is very different from paying wages to employees in corporations. The president's visit, not to Pittsburgh, but to Allegheny over the river, had one beneficial result. Members of the City Council of Pittsburgh reminded me that I had first offered Pittsburgh money for a library and hall, which it declined, and that then Allegheny City had asked if I would give them to her, which I did. The president visiting Allegheny to open the library and hall there, and the ignoring of Pittsburgh, was too much. Her authorities came to me again the morning after the Allegheny City opening, asking if I would renew my offer to Pittsburgh. If so, the city would accept and agree to expend upon maintenance a large percentage than I had previously asked. I was only too happy to do this, and instead of 250,000, I offered $1 million. My ideas had expanded. Thus was started the Carnegie Institute. Pittsburgh's leading citizens are spending freely upon artistic things. This center of manufacturing has had its permanent orchestra for some years, Boston and Chicago being the only other cities in America that can boast of one. A naturalist club and a school of painting have sprung up. The success of library, art gallery, museum, and music hall, a noble quartet in an immense building, is one of the chief satisfactions of my life. This is my monument, because here I lived my early life and made my start, and I am today in heart a devoted son of dear old smoky Pittsburgh. Herbert Spencer heard, while with us in Pittsburgh, some account of the rejection of my first offer of a library to Pittsburgh. When the second offer was made, he wrote me that he did not understand how I could renew it. He never could have done so. They did not deserve it. I wrote the philosopher that if I had made the first offer to Pittsburgh that I might receive her thanks and gratitude, I deserved the personal arrows shot at me and the accusations made that only my own glorification and a monument to my memory were sought. I should then probably have felt as he did. But as it was the good of the people of Pittsburgh I had in view, among whom I had made my fortune, the unfounded suspicions of some natures only quickened my desire to work their good by planting in their midst a potent influence for higher things. This the Institute, thank the kind fates, has done. Pittsburgh has played her part nobly. End of chapter 26. Recording by William Tomko. Chapter 27 of Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomko. Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. Chapter 27. Washington Diplomacy. President Harrison had been a soldier and as president was a little disposed to fight. His attitude gave some of his friends concern. He was opposed to arbitrating the Bering Sea question when Lord Salisbury, at the dictation of Canada, had to repudiate the Blaine Agreement for its settlement, and was disposed to proceed to extreme measures. But calmer counsels prevailed. He was determined also to uphold the force bill against the South. When the quarrel arose with Chile, there was a time when it seemed almost impossible to keep the president from taking action which would have resulted in war. He had great personal provocation because the Chilean authorities had been most indiscreet in their statements in regard to his action. I went to Washington to see whether I could not do something toward reconciling the belligerents, because, having been a member of the first Pan American Conference, I had become acquainted with the representatives from our southern sister republics and was on good terms with them. As luck would have it, I was just entering the Shoreham Hotel when I saw Senator Henderson of Missouri, who had been my fellow delegate to the conference. He stopped and greeted me, and looking across the street, he said, "There's the president beckoning to you." I crossed the street. "Hello, Carnegie. When did you arrive?" "Just arrived, Mr. President. I was entering the hotel." "What are you here for?" "To have a talk with you." "Well, come along and talk as we walk." The president took my arm, and we promenaded the streets of Washington in the dusk for more than an hour, during which time the discussion was lively. I told him that he had appointed me a delegate to the Pan American Conference, that he had assured the South American delegates when they parted that he had given a military review in their honor to show them, not that we had an army, but rather that we had none and needed none, that we were the big brother in the family of republics, and that all disputes, if any arose, would be settled by peaceful arbitration. I was therefore surprised and grieved to find that he was now apparently taking a different course, threatening to resort to war in a paltry dispute with little Chile. "You're a New Yorker, and think nothing but business and dollars. That is the way with New Yorkers. They care nothing for the dignity and honor of the Republic," said His Excellency. "Mr. President, I am one of the men in the United States who would profit most by war. It might throw millions into my pockets as the largest manufacturer of steel." "Well, that is probably true in your case. I had forgotten." "Mr. President, if I were going to fight, I would take someone of my size." "Well, would you let any nation insult and dishonor you because of its size?" "Mr. President, no man can dishonor me except myself. Honor wounds must be self-inflicted." "You see our sailors were attacked on shore and two of them killed, and you would stand that?" he asked. "Mr. President, I do not think the United States dishonored every time a row among drunken sailors takes place. Besides, these were not American sailors at all. They were foreigners, as you see by their names. I would be disposed to cashier the captain of that ship for allowing the sailors to go on shore when there was rioting in the town and the public peace had been already disturbed." The discussion continued until we had finally reached the door of the White House in the dark. The president told me he had an engagement to dine out that night, but invited me to dine with him the next evening, when, as he said, there would be only the family and we could talk. "I am greatly honored, and shall be with you tomorrow evening," I said, and so we parted. The next morning I went over to see Mr. Blaine, then Secretary of State. He rose from his seat and held out both hands. "Oh, why weren't you dining with us last night?" When the president told Mrs. Blaine that you were in town, she said, "Just think, Mr. Carnegie is in town and I had a vacant seat here he could have occupied." "Well, Mr. Blaine, I think it is rather fortunate that I have not seen you," I replied, and I then told him what had occurred with the president. "Yes," he said, "it really was fortunate. The president might have thought you and I were in collusion." Senator Elkins of West Virginia, a bosom friend of Mr. Blaine and also a very good friend of the president, happened to come in, and he said he had seen the president, who told him that he had had a talk with me upon the Chilean affair last evening, and that I had come down hot upon the subject. "Well, Mr. President," said Senator Elkins, "it is not probable that Mr. Carnegie would speak as plainly to you as he would to me. He feels very keenly, but he would naturally be somewhat reserved in talking to you." The president replied, "I didn't see the slightest indication of reserve, I assure you." The matter was adjusted, thanks to the peace policy characteristic of Mr. Blaine. More than once he kept the United States out of foreign trouble, as I personally knew. The reputation that he had of being an aggressive American really enabled that great man to make concessions which, made by another, might not have been readily accepted by the people. I had a long and friendly talk with the President that evening at dinner, but he was not looking at all well. I ventured to say to him he needed a rest. By all means, he should get away. He said he had intended going off on a revenue cutter for a few days, but Judge Bradley of the Supreme Court had died and he must find a worthy successor. I said there was one I could not recommend because we had fished together and were such intimate friends that we could not judge each other disinterestedly, but he might inquire about him. Mr. Shiraz of Pittsburgh. He did so and appointed him. Mr. Shiraz received the strong support of the best elements everywhere. Neither my recommendation nor that of anyone else would have weighed with President Harrison one particle in making the appointment if he had not found Mr. Shiraz the very man he wanted. In the Bering Sea dispute, the President was incensed at Lord Salisbury's repudiation of the stipulations for settling the question which had been agreed to. The President had determined to reject the counter proposition to submit it to arbitration. Mr. Blaine was with the President in this, and naturally indignant that his plan, which Salisbury had extolled through his ambassador, had been discarded. I found both of them in no compromising mood. The President was much the more excited of the two, however. Talking it over with Mr. Blaine alone, I explained to him that Salisbury was powerless. Against Canada's protest he could not force acceptance of the stipulations to which he had hastily agreed. There was another element. He had a dispute with Newfoundland on hand, which the latter was insisting must be settled to her advantage. No government in Britain could add Canadian dissatisfaction to that of Newfoundland. Salisbury had done the best he could. After a while, Blaine was convinced of this and succeeded in bringing the President into line. The Bering Sea troubles brought about some rather amusing situations. One day, Sir John Macdonald, Canadian Premier, and his party reached Washington and asked Mr. Blaine to arrange an interview with the President upon this subject. Mr. Blaine replied that he would see the President and inform Sir John the next morning. "Of course," said Mr. Blaine, telling me the story in Washington just after the incident occurred. "I knew very well that the President could not meet Sir John and his friends officially, and when they called I told them so. Sir John said that Canada was independent, as sovereign as the state of New York was in the Union." Mr. Blaine replied he was afraid that if he ever obtained an interview as Premier of Canada with the state authorities of New York, he would soon hear something on the subject from Washington, and so would the New York state authorities. It was because the President and Mr. Blaine were convinced that the British government at home could not fulfill the stipulations agreed upon that they accepted Salisbury's proposal for arbitration, believing he had done his best. That was a very sore disappointment to Mr. Blaine. He had suggested that Britain and America should each place two small vessels on Bering Sea with equal rights to board or arrest fishing vessels under either flag, in fact, a joint police force. To give Salisbury due credit, he cabled the British ambassador, Sir Julian Pauncefote, to congratulate Mr. Blaine upon his brilliant suggestion. It would have given equal rights to each, and under either or both flags for the first time in history. A just and brotherly compact. Sir Julian had shown this cable to Mr. Blaine. I mention this here to suggest that able and willing statesmen anxious to cooperate are sometimes unable to do so. Mr. Blaine was indeed a great statesman, a man of wide views, sound judgment, and always for peace. Upon war with Chile, upon the Force Bill, and the Bering Sea question, he was calm, wise, and peace pursuing. Especially was he favorable to drawing closer and closer to our own English speaking race. For France, he had gratitude unbounded for the part she had played in our Revolutionary War, but this did not cause him to lose his head. One night at dinner in London, Mr. Blaine was at close quarters for a moment. The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty came up. A leading statesman present said that the impression they had was that Mr. Blaine had always been inimical to the mother country. Mr. Blaine disclaimed this, and justly so. as far as I knew his sentiments. His correspondence upon the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty was instanced. Mr. Blaine replied, "When I became Secretary of State and had to take up that subject, I was surprised to find that your Secretary for Foreign Affairs was always informing us what Her Majesty expected, while our Secretary of State was telling you what our President ventured to hope. When I received a dispatch telling us what Her Majesty expected, I replied, telling you what our President expected." "Well, you admit you changed the character of the correspondence," was shot at him. Quick as a flash came the response, "Not more than conditions had changed. The United States had passed the stage of venturing to hope with any power that expects. I only followed your example, and should ever Her Majesty venture to hope, the President will always be found doing the same.
Cause
I
she
am
my little
afraid
dog,
that as long
she my
as
best friend, and I got big shoes, this ain't no size 10. The way I'm rocking them, the way I'm walking in, the way I'm walking in. Cause she my little dog, she my best friend, and I got big shoes, this ain't no size 10. The way I'm rocking them, the way I'm walking in, the way I'm walking in.